Hello, everybody. Today we're talking about African American advocates, specifically three men. Let's get started. The objective question for today is who advocated for African Americans and how did their strategies differ? Before we get into these men, let's make sure that we understand the climate that we're in at this point. So the status quo, or the way things are at this point, we have segregation going on. We have whites and blacks being segregated in public areas. We have different school systems. We have pretty much separate everything. And that is because of Plessy v. Ferguson. Remember that this was the court case that determined that segregation was not unconstitutional. It did not violate the 14th Amendment, and it allowed for separate but equal to exist. And this is the status quo at this point throughout the United States, which helps explain why there are, people advocating for change. The first individual we're going to talk about today is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was out of the three that we're going to talk about today, was the only individual to be born a slave. So he was born in the South prior to the Civil War. And when he was very young, the Civil War occurred, and he, of course, was granted freedom. After this, he's going to go to work in the mines, and he's going to work and scrounge and save his money and put himself through college on his own. He believes in his core philosophy that we'll continue to refer back to is all about gradual change. He felt that African Americans need to earn their equality, that it won't be given by the white people. Instead, African Americans are going to have to earn that. They have to earn the ability to have equal rights in the United States. And this is, of course, going to be a very gradual and slow process. But Booker T. Washington was okay with that. Now, a cornerstone of Booker T. Washington's philosophy of this gradual change includes vocational training or trade schools, trade jobs. He believed that in order for African Americans to move up in society, they're going to need to prove that they're actually useful. And they're going to do this by learning trades and learning skills and giving back to the community and proving to the white portion of the community that they're, useful. This really comes to a head in one of his very famous speeches called the Atlanta Compromise, where he encourages African Americans to not protest, don't riot, don't rock the boat. Instead, put your head down, get to work, and eventually we'll all be equal. This, of course, was very unpopular with some of the more radical African American advocates, as we'll see. Another big accomplishment of Booker T. Washington was that he opened a school called the Tuskegee Institute. This institute was an opportunity for African Americans to learn trade skills that they could then apply to, the workforce and become, as Booker T. Washington continues to say, useful. We're also going to have some African Americans train there military-wise and serve in World War II. The book he writes is an autobiography called Up From Slavery. An autobiography, remember, is a book that you write about your own life. Right? So Up From Slavery makes sense since he's the only one of the three to ever be, in slavery. Because Booker T. Washington's approach was so gradual, and because it didn't change or call for radical change, and because this was a very slow-moving agenda, out of the three of these men, majority of white people supported Booker T. Washington. They liked the gradual approach that he pushed for. Now, in contrast to Booker T. Washington, we have W.E.B. Du Bois, the complete opposite. While Booker T. Washington was born into slavery, W.E.B. Du Bois was born free and born in the North. So he didn't really have firsthand experience with slavery. And he was very, very much against Booker T. Washington's gradual approach. He said that equality should happen immediately, that African Americans had waited long enough, and that the gradual approach was seen as just appeasing white people. W.E.B. Du Bois thought that radical change was what we should push for and that we should have equality immediately. One way he plans to carry this out is the talented 10th. So the idea that we tour the country and we find the top 10% of African Americans, the smartest, brightest, most promising individuals, And then the African American community makes sure to support these people. They send them to school, they put them in law school, they help them get government positions, they help them get elected, and by placing these really, really wealthy, successful, prestigious African Americans in these positions, the entire African American race will be elevated. So it's taking the strongest people, investing in them, and that will pay off for the rest of the community. That's the whole idea behind the Talented 10th, W.E.B. Du Bois's kind of platform. Now, some accomplishments of Du Bois. He's the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard. He was a strong believer in higher education and that all African Americans should strive to be as educated as they possibly can. He writes a book called The Souls of Black Folk. Remember that he was not a slave. But he did tour the South after the end of slavery, and he asked people about their experiences, and he kind of compiled all of their stories into a collective memoir that he then published. He was also a writer for an African American newspaper called The Crisis, which would help promote his views and call for action and stuff like that. He's also going to be the founder of two major African American organizations that we'll talk about on the next slide. So, the Niagara Movement, one of the first coming together of African American leaders, kind of a call to action. The equivalent of this would be the Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Suffrage, coming together, a pushing for beliefs, a kind of round table to kind of get ideas out there. Then, a few years later, we have the much more successful association born, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, otherwise known as the NAACP. The NAACP was a very successful organization during this time and is still around today. Some of the early wins and victories that the NAACP is going to secure for African Americans during this time period includes Ginn versus U.S. 1915. It's going to help Oklahoma get rid of the grandfather clause. We remember the grandfather clause. After African Americans are granted the right to vote, well, African American males, people in the South try to put barriers in place to prevent those individuals from voting. So it can't be based on their race, but what they can do are place things like literacy tests and poll taxes in the way to disenfranchise those individuals. The downside for the white people in the South was that also disenfranchised some of the poor, uneducated white people in the South as well. So the solution was, of course, the grandfather clause, simply saying that if your grandfather could vote, so could you. This was obviously just another measure to disenfranchise African American men. The NAACP argued that and won successfully and ended the use of the grandfather clause in Oklahoma. The second example we have right here, Buchanan versus Worley. 2 years later, the NAACP is going to successfully end housing discrimination in the state of Kentucky. Another big win there. And as I mentioned, the NAACP is still around today. Now, when we look at these two individuals side by side, we see some big differences. Booker T. Washington, as I mentioned, born in the South as a slave. W.E.B. Du Bois, born in the North, free. Booker T. Washington wanted gradual change. W.E.B. Du Bois pushed for instant, immediate action. Booker T. Washington believed that people should learn trade jobs, should get their hands dirty, and gradually rise up. W.E.B. Du Bois believed in the Talented 10th and believed that people should get as much education as they can, right? And that the Talented 10th would rise everybody else up. Now that we've covered those two, let's cover our third man, Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was born in Jamaica, and unlike some of the two individuals we've already spoken about, Marcus Garvey actually loved segregation. He thought it was a great idea. He encouraged it. He did not have a problem with it. One of the major things he advocated for was Pan-Africanism, which is the idea that all African Americans should go back to Africa. And he founds a group, an African American group, called the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. So there's that nifty little acronym right there. Kind of a mouthful. Probably don't beat yourself up about memorizing that one. Now, I mentioned that Marcus Garvey loved segregation, and that's because he believed that blacks were superior to whites. He thought that it was great that in America blacks and whites were segregated because he didn't want to be around white people. He believed that they were inferior and that blacks should be completely separate. Now, so separate he believes that blacks and whites should be that he believes that all black people, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, should all go to Africa. Okay? People who hadn't even been to Africa before in their lives should all go to Africa. He's going to carry out this plan with this giant ship called the Black Star Line. Think of like a giant cruise ship, but without all the bells and whistles on them. Okay, so he's going to use this ship, he's going to pull up to the East Coast, and he's going to load as many black people onto that ship as he can, and he's going to ship it off to Africa. And eventually, theoretically, you get all of the black people in the entire world back to Africa, and they can form their own perfect society, their utopian society, where it's black people and nobody else. This is Marcus Garvey's end goal. This is his dream. Now, if we had to compare these three individuals, which I'm asking you to do with the objective question, how would we do it? Well, I would put them on a spectrum between gradual on one end and extreme measures on the other. In any spectrum you look at, Booker T. Washington is going to be on that gradual side. He believed step by step, slow and steady, let's get it done. And this makes sense because remember that Booker T. Washington actually was a slave himself and has, over the course of his lifetime, seen multiple changes when it comes to race relations. So it makes sense that he'd be more willing to be more patient. Now, on the other end, the extreme measure side, I would put Marcus Garvey. He was so extreme that he believed that black people who had never even been to Africa, should all leave America and go to Africa. This has, of course, some implications here. We have people who have never left America, leaving America. We have people who have never been to Africa, going to Africa. There's going to be a lot of problems there, and the plan falls apart. It's never really successful, of course. And then, if you're putting all three on a spectrum, we, of course, have to put Du Bois in the middle. He was much more radical than Booker T. Washington, but when compared to Garvey, he's seen as a moderate. He says, listen, simply, African Americans are tired of waiting, but we're not about to leave, and we're definitely not about to say segregation is great. All we want are equal rights, and we want them now. So, those are the three African American advocates we're going to cover in class today. Go ahead and complete your objective questions, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.